first rule of running away is to not look back. The second is to find a place so bland, so devoid of memory, that your ghost can't find purchase. This apartment was my masterpiece of bland. Beige walls, beige carpet, a window that looked out onto a brick wall so close you could read the mason's stamp if you pressed your face to the glass. It was a place for a person to disappear into the grout of their own life. I'd been here 3 weeks. A refugee from a relationship that had imploded with the quiet, devastating force of a dying star. Alex had taken everything of value. The good sofa, the art, my sense of self. I was left with 2 suitcases, a box of books I hadn't had the heart to look at yet, and a persistent ache behind my sternum that I was trying to ignore into oblivion. My roommate, Julian, was part of the bland package. He was the friend of a cousin, a name on a lease who needed someone to cover the other half of the rent after his last roommate moved out. We'd had one stilted phone call where he'd mostly just said yep and okay in a low, even voice. He was a carpenter, or a woodworker, or something equally tangible and archaic. When I moved in, he'd helped me carry my boxes up 3 flights of stairs without breaking a sweat or conversation, offered me a bottle of water, and then retreated into his room, closing the door with a soft click. He was a ghost of a different sort, present but unobtrusive, a steady, silent hum in the background of my self-imposed exile. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with hands that looked like they could palm a basketball or fix a broken engine with equal ease. They were cross-hatched with pale, silvery scars and perpetually dusted with the faint scent of sawdust and turpentine. He moved with a kind of deliberate economy, never a wasted gesture. It was unnerving. Alex had been a firework of a person, all chaotic energy and grand, sweeping movements that took up all the oxygen in a room. Julian was a rock, unmoving, unreadable. For the first few weeks, our interactions were limited to polite nods in the hallway and mumbled mornings over the coffee maker. It was perfect. He required nothing of me. He didn't ask where I'd come from or why I looked like I hadn't slept properly in a month. He just refilled the coffee filters when they were empty and took out the recycling on Tuesdays. He was a fixed point in the chaos of my retreat, and I was grateful for the space he afforded me. I was rebuilding my walls, brick by painful brick, and I didn't need anyone trying to look over them. The first crack appeared on a Thursday morning. I was late, rushing to get ready for a freelance graphic design job I was doing remotely, a lifeline that allowed me to work from this beige bunker. I stumbled into the kitchen, my head thick with the dregs of a restless sleep, to find Julian already there, leaning against the counter, nursing a mug of coffee. He was dressed for work in worn jeans and a faded gray t-shirt that stretched across his shoulders. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice gravelly. "Hey," I managed, fumbling for a mug. My hand slipped and it clattered against the counter. I flinched. He didn't react, just took a slow sip of his coffee. The silence stretched, filled only by the hum of the refrigerator. I felt his eyes on me as I scooped coffee grounds into the filter, my hand still unsteady. "You were snoring again last night," he said, his tone completely flat. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a complaint. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered with the same emotional weight as if he'd said, "It looks like rain." But to me, it was a mortar blast against my carefully constructed walls. My face burned hot. It was one of Alex's favorite weapons, my snoring. He'd called it uncute. A chainsaw, something to be wielded in arguments. "Of course I'm tired, Leo. You kept me up all night with that racket." The shame was instant and suffocating. I gripped the edge of the counter, my knuckles white. "Oh," I said, my voice tight. "Sorry about that." "Don't be," he said, pushing off the counter.
He rinsed his mug in the sink, the water drumming against the ceramic. Just loud. He dried his hands on a towel, and for a second, I thought he might say something else, something kind or something cruel. But he just nodded once, a quick, dismissive gesture, and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with the gurgling coffee maker and the echoing shame. It was just a fact. I was loud. I took up space even in my sleep, even when I was trying so hard to be invisible. The snoring comment burrowed under my skin and festered. It was a stupid thing, a ridiculous thing to be so hung up on. But it represented a loss of control. I could curate my waking hours, present a facade of someone who was fine, who was holding it together. But sleep was a betrayal. In sleep, I was vulnerable, noisy, a nuisance. I became obsessed. I downloaded 3 different anti-snoring apps that promised to monitor my sleep cycles with soothing whale songs. I bought expensive nasal strips that made my eyes water and left red marks on my nose. I tried sleeping propped up on a mountain of pillows, which only resulted in a crippling neck ache. I started policing my evenings, avoiding a second glass of wine, cutting out late-night snacks, all in a desperate attempt to silence my unconscious self. My nights became a new kind of battlefield, and I was losing. The exhaustion settled deep into my bones. I was jumpy and irritable, my work suffered, and my already frayed nerves felt stripped raw. The apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a panopticon. Was he listening? Could he hear me breathing from his room down the hall? Every creak of the floorboards outside my door sent a jolt of anxiety through me. The dependency I'd been so desperate to avoid began to manifest in small, humiliating ways. One morning,
bleary-eyed from another night of failed sleep hacking, I reached for the fancy olive oil on the top shelf and knocked over a jar of pickles instead. It shattered on the tile floor, a supernova of glass and brine. The smell was acidic and overwhelming. I just stood there staring at the mess, feeling a hysterical laugh bubble in my chest. This was my life now, crying over spilled pickles. Before I could move, Julian was there. He must have heard the crash. He didn't say a word. He just took in the scene. Me, frozen and pathetic, the pickle apocalypse on the floor, and moved past me to get the dustpan and a roll of paper towels. "Go sit down," he said, his voice low and firm. It wasn't a suggestion. "I'll handle it." Humiliation warred with a desperate sense of relief. I wanted to argue, to insist I could clean up my own mess, but the fight just wasn't in me. My pride was a thin, brittle thing these days. I retreated to the small, wobbly kitchen table and watched as he methodically swept up the large shards of glass, then carefully blotted up the pickle juice with a thick wad of paper towels. His movements were efficient. Sure. He wiped the floor twice, then took the trash straight out, leaving the kitchen smelling only faintly of dill. He came back in, washed his hands, and then, to my utter astonishment, started making coffee. He didn't look at me. He just moved through the familiar motions, a silent, capable presence. "I can do that," I said, my voice raspy. "I'm already doing it," he replied without turning around. He poured coffee into 2 mugs and placed one on the table in front of me. He took the other and leaned against the counter, the same way he had that morning he'd first mentioned the snoring. We sat in silence for a full minute. I stared into my mug, watching the steam curl and dissipate. I should say thank you. I should apologize for the mess. I should say something, anything, to fill the vast, echoing space between us. "The walls are thin," he said suddenly, his voice startlingly gentle. I looked up. He was watching me, his expression unreadable. "I hear you up at night, pacing, tossing, and turning." My stomach clenched. He knew I was a mess. "It's fine, Leo," he continued, as if reading my mind. "The snoring, it's just a noise, it doesn't bother me." "It bothered my ex," I blurted out, the words tasting like ash. I hadn't meant to say it. It was a piece of myself I hadn't offered to anyone. Julian considered this for a moment, his gaze steady. "Well," he said, taking a sip of his coffee, "I'm not your ex." He pushed off the counter and walked toward the door. "Get some sleep, you look like hell." It was the kindest thing anyone had said to me in months. It was also the moment I realized that my plan to disappear into the beige was failing spectacularly. I wasn't invisible to him at all. He saw me, exhausted and broken and surrounded by shattered pickles. And he didn't flinch. He just made me coffee. A week of solid rain trapped us in the apartment. The sky turned a bruised purple-gray and wept, a miserable, persistent drizzle that soaked into the city's bones and made the world outside our window seem blurry and indistinct. My remote work was slow, and Julian's carpentry jobs were on hold due to the weather. The beige box that was our apartment shrank around us. There was no escape. We were two ships moored in the same small, quiet harbor, forced to acknowledge each other's presence. My anxiety about him, about my snoring, about my general state of patheticness, began to slowly, almost imperceptibly, give way to a quiet curiosity. I started watching him. He had routines that were as solid and dependable as he was. He was up at 6 every morning. The scent of his strong, dark coffee, a precursor to the sunrise that never came. He would sit at the kitchen table with a worn-out paperback, the pages soft and fanned from countless readings, and he would read for exactly 1 hour. His focus was absolute. He didn't fidget or get distracted. He just inhabited the world of the book. After that, he would disappear into his workshop, a converted spare bedroom at the back of the apartment. The sounds that came from it were rhythmic and soothing. The rasp of a hand plane against wood, the soft scrape of sandpaper, the low hum of a lathe. They were sounds of creation, of something being made from nothing, and I found them strangely comforting. In the evenings, he would cook. He wasn't a fancy chef, but he was competent and efficient, moving around the small kitchen with an unhurried grace that I envied. He made simple, hearty things, stews that simmered for hours, roasted chicken, thick slabs of cornbread. He always made enough for 2. He never asked if I wanted any. He just left a plate for me on the counter before taking his own to the living room to eat while watching some nature documentary. The first time he did it, I stared at the plate for a full 10 minutes. A war raging in my stomach. Accepting it felt like a concession. Another step into a dependency I was supposed to be fighting. But the smell of the beef stew was rich and warm, and I hadn't eaten a real meal in days. I ate it, standing at the kitchen counter, feeling like a stray cat being fed on a back porch. It was the best thing I had tasted in months. After that, it became our unspoken ritual. He cooked. I ate. I started washing the dishes in return, leaving them to dry in the rack. It was a silent conversation, a bartering of small domestic kindnesses. One rainy afternoon, the steady rasp of sandpaper from his workshop stopped. A few minutes later, he emerged, wiping his hands on a rag. He had a fine layer of sawdust clinging to his dark hair and the stubble on his jaw. "The internet's out," he announced. I checked my laptop. He was right. The little Wi-Fi symbol had a fatalistic exclamation point next to it. "Storm must have knocked it out," he said, walking over to the window and peering out at the deluge. "Probably won't be back on until tomorrow." The idea of being completely cut off, trapped in the apartment with him and my own thoughts, sent a fresh spike of panic through me. "Right," I said, closing my laptop. "Great." He seemed unperturbed. He went to a bookshelf I hadn't paid much attention to before. It was filled not with the trendy paperbacks I owned, but with old, hard-bound books on botany, woodworking, and local history. He pulled out a heavy, leather-bound volume. "Ever played cribbage?" he asked, turning around. He was holding a small, intricately carved wooden board. "No," I said. "I'll teach you." He sat down at the kitchen table and began to explain the rules, his voice a low, patient rumble. I listened, distracted by his hands as he shuffled the worn deck of cards. They were large and clean, but the lines on his palms were etched with old calluses, the knuckles slightly swollen. Scars, thin and white, crisscrossed the backs. These hands knew work. They knew how to hold, how to shape, how to fix. They were the complete opposite of mine, which spent their days clicking a mouse and tapping on a keyboard. We played for hours. I was terrible at first, but he was a patient teacher, pointing out plays I'd missed, explaining the strategy behind pegging and counting. The rain drummed against the window pane, a steady rhythm section to the soft snap of the cards. For the first time since I'd moved in, I completely forgot to be anxious. I forgot about Alex, about my snoring, about the mess my life had become. There was only the rain, the cards, and the quiet, steady presence of the man sitting across from me. The rain finally broke on the third day, leaving the city washed clean and smelling of wet earth and asphalt. The silence in the apartment felt different, less like an absence and more like a shared, comfortable space. That evening, Julian was in his workshop, the familiar sound of his tools a quiet backdrop to the evening. I found myself lingering in the hallway, drawn by the scent of cedar. The door was ajar. I peered inside. It was a space of organized chaos. Tools hung in neat rows on a pegboard wall, each with its own specific place. The air was thick with the clean, sharp smell of wood. Shavings curled like fallen leaves on the floor around a half-finished piece on his workbench. A small, elegant rocking horse, its lines smooth and lyrical. Julian was bent over it, his brow furrowed in concentration as he carefully sanded a curved edge. He was so completely absorbed in his work that he didn't notice me. I watched, mesmerized, as his scarred, capable hands moved over the wood, transforming a rough block into something beautiful and gentle. He must have felt my gaze because he looked up, his eyes meeting mine. I expected him to be annoyed at the intrusion, but his expression was neutral. He straightened up, wiping a sheen of sweat from his forehead with the back of his wrist. "Hey," he said. "Sorry," I stammered, feeling like I'd been caught spying. "I was just... What is that?" "A rocking horse," he said, running a hand over the smooth arch of its neck. "For my niece. Her birthday's next month." "It's beautiful," I said, and I meant it. "You're really talented." A faint flush crept up his neck. He shrugged, a gesture that was somehow both dismissive and pleased. "It's just wood." He picked up a piece of sandpaper. "Keeps my hands busy." We stood in a silence that felt charged with unspoken things. I wanted to ask him about his niece, about his family, about how he learned to do this, to create things of such simple, profound beauty. But the words wouldn't come. The habit of keeping to myself was too deeply ingrained. Later that night, I was sitting on the sofa nursing a cup of tea and pretending to read a book. My mind was still on the workshop, on the rocking horse, on the quiet man who built it. Julian came out of his room and sat in the armchair opposite me. He didn't turn on the TV or pick up a book. He just sat, sipping from a mug, his long legs stretched out in front of him. The silence felt different again, expectant. "My ex," I said, the words falling into the quiet room like stones into a still pond. "He used to complain about my snoring. A lot." I didn't know why I was telling him this. It felt like picking at a scab, a needless act of self-exposure. But I felt compelled to fill the space between us with something true. Julian looked at me over the rim of his mug. His eyes were a dark, indeterminate color in the dim light. He didn't offer platitudes or easy reassurances, he just listened. He said it made me unattractive, I continued, the word tasting foul. That it was something I should fix, like it was a character flaw, not just a thing my body does when I'm unconscious. I let out a short, bitter laugh. I spent hundreds on gadgets and sprays. I even went to a sleep clinic once. Nothing worked. It just became another thing he could use against me. Another piece of evidence in the case for why I wasn't good enough. The confession left me feeling hollowed out, raw. I waited for him to say something, to shift uncomfortably, to make an excuse and leave. Instead, he just set his mug down on the coaster with a soft click. "Sleep's important," he said, his voice calm and even. "Can't help what you do when you're out. Anyone who gives you hell for something you can't control isn't worth losing sleep over." He held my gaze for a long moment. There was no pity in his eyes, only a simple, solid acceptance. It was like a dam inside me had cracked. I felt the hot sting of tears behind my eyes, the first I'd allowed myself to feel in months. I looked down at my hands, clenching them in my lap to keep them from shaking. He didn't say anything else. He just sat there with me in the quiet, a silent witness to my crumbling facade. And his presence was a strange and powerful comfort. The next evening, we were in the kitchen together. I was making a salad, a clumsy attempt to contribute something to our silent meal contract, and Julian was at the stove, searing a piece of fish. The air was filled with the smell of garlic and lemon. My confession from the night before hung between us. A new, fragile bridge I was terrified would collapse. I expected him to be distant, to retreat back into his comfortable silence now that I'd unloaded my emotional baggage into our shared living space. Instead, he seemed softer. The set of his shoulders was less rigid, and when he glanced at me, the look in his eyes was thoughtful. "My dad was a builder," he said, his voice quiet, directed at the sizzling pan but clearly meant for me. He could build a house from the ground up with his own two hands. Never used a calculator, did all the math in his head. Strongest man I ever knew. He flipped the fish with a deft flick of his wrist. He was also the quietest. My mom used to say he could go a whole day on a dozen words. He wasn't unkind, just contained. He showed his love by doing. Fixing the porch swing, building my sister a dollhouse, making sure the car always ran. Words weren't his language. He paused and I found myself holding my breath, waiting. "I was with someone for a long time," he continued, his gaze still fixed on the stove. "She was a lot of words. She needed to hear them all the time. I love you, I miss you, you're my everything, and I tried, I really did. But it never felt natural. It felt like I was reciting lines from a play. My language is doing. Fixing things, building things, being there." He finally turned to look at me, and his eyes were filled with a deep, ancient sadness. "She said my silence felt like a punishment, that I was withholding. She left because she said she needed to hear the music, and all I could give her was the quiet." He turned back to the stove, the moment of vulnerability passing as quickly as it had come. "Anyway," he said, his voice back to its usual low rumble. "Fish is done." He slid the perfectly cooked fillets onto 2 plates, next to the salad I'd made. My hands were shaking slightly as I took my plate from him. He had taken the fragile bridge I'd built and walked across it, meeting me in the middle. He had seen my hurt and offered his own in return. It was a trade of scars, a quiet acknowledgement that we were both fluent in the language of things left unsaid. We ate in our usual silence, but it was different now. It was no longer an empty space, but one filled with a shared understanding. The quiet wasn't an absence. It was a language all its own, and I was finally beginning to understand it. The realization settled over me that my beige, bland sanctuary had become something else entirely. It was becoming a home. The quiet, steady man who lived here was becoming the anchor I hadn't even known I was looking for. A few nights later, the inevitable
happened. I was working late on a deadline, fueled by too much coffee and the low-grade anxiety that came with client revisions. I finished around 2 a.m., my eyes burning and my brain feeling like fuzzy static. I didn't even have the energy to make it to my bedroom. I collapsed onto the living room sofa, pulling the worn Afghan from the back of it over me. The cushions smelled faintly of him, of sawdust and that clean, simple soap he used. The scent was grounding, and I drifted off almost instantly, falling into a deep, exhausted sleep. I surfaced sometime later, floating in that strange, hazy space between sleep and waking. The apartment was dark, silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. I was aware of a presence, a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. I heard the soft click of the front door, followed by quiet footsteps on the rug. It was Julian, coming in from I didn't know where. A late shift? A friend's house? My mind was too syrupy to form a coherent thought. I kept my eyes closed, feigning a deeper sleep than I was in. It felt safer than having to explain why I was passed out in our common area. I felt him stop near the sofa. I could sense his stillness, his nearness. The air stirred as he moved, and then I felt the gentle weight of another blanket settling over me, warmer and heavier than the Afghan. He was tucking me in. My heart gave a painful, stupid lurch. It was such a small, tender gesture. He lingered for a moment. I could feel his warmth, smell the cool night air still clinging to his jacket. I held my breath, every nerve-ending tingling with a strange, new awareness. He shifted, leaning closer. I thought he was going to walk away. But then I felt the ghost of a touch. The barest whisper of his knuckles brushing a stray piece of hair from my forehead. The contact was electric, a jolt that shot straight through me. My whole body tensed under the blankets. And then he spoke. His voice was impossibly soft, a low murmur that was more vibration than sound, meant for no one but himself. "You're snoring again," he whispered. But the words were completely transformed. They weren't the flat, factual statement from that first morning in the kitchen. They weren't a complaint or an observation. The tone, it was honeyed with something I couldn't dare to name. It was gentle. It was intimate. It sounded impossibly like affection. It sounded like fondness. He sighed, a soft, quiet sound, and then I heard his footsteps retreat down the hall, followed by the soft click of his bedroom door closing. I lay there in the darkness, my eyes wide open, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure he must have heard it. The gentle weight of the blanket, the phantom touch on my forehead, the echo of that whispered, tender complaint. It all coalesced into a revelation that stole my breath. He wasn't just tolerating my noise. He wasn't just accepting my broken pieces. The sound of my vulnerability, the very thing I was so ashamed of, was something he had come to care about. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just lay there, replaying the moment over and over, the warmth of it spreading through my chest, a terrifying, brilliant dawn breaking inside me. The next few days were an exercise in exquisite torture. The entire apartment felt like it was humming with a low-level electrical current. The space between us, once a comfortable buffer, was now charged with an unbearable tension. Every time we passed in the narrow hallway, the air crackled. If his arm brushed mine as we both reached for the milk in the fridge, My skin would burn for an hour. I couldn't look him in the eye. I was afraid of what he would see in mine, and even more terrified of what I might see in his. I replayed his whispered words in my head on a continuous loop. "You're snoring again." Had I imagined the tenderness? Had my sleep-addled brain invented the affection in his tone? It was impossible. But the alternative was even more impossible. He seemed different too. Or maybe I was just seeing him differently. He was still quiet, still steady. But there was a new watchfulness in his gaze. I'd look up from my laptop and find him looking at me from the kitchen, his expression soft and unreadable, before he'd quickly look away. He started leaving things for me. A perfect apple from the farmer's market on my desk, a new paperback by an author I'd mentioned I liked on the arm of the sofa, small, silent offerings that felt deafeningly loud. My internal monologue became a frantic, desperate scream. What was this? What were we doing? I was a mess, a refugee hiding from my own life. I had nothing to offer, and he was solid. He was good and kind and deserved someone who wasn't held together with tape and spite. I tried to pull back, to rebuild the walls he had so effortlessly dismantled. I ate meals in my room. I wore headphones in the living room. I tried to make myself small and invisible again. But it was too late. He had already seen me. The unspoken thing between us grew until it filled all the available space in the apartment. It was in the steam from the coffee maker in the morning, in the motes of dust dancing in the afternoon light, in the heavy silence of the evenings. I felt like I was holding my breath, waiting for a storm to break. I couldn't live like this, suspended in the unbearable space between what was and what could be. The tension was a wire pulled taut, and I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that it was about to snap. I was a coward. I had spent months running away from confrontation, but I couldn't run from this. He was in my home. He was in my head. He was everywhere. The breaking point came on a Saturday night. He was at his workbench, and I was pacing the length of the living room like a caged animal. I couldn't take it anymore. The silence was screaming. I walked down the hall and stood in the doorway of his workshop. He was planing a piece of
maple, the long, rhythmic strokes of his arms the only sound. The scent of the wood was sharp and clean. He looked up as my shadow fell across his bench. He stopped working, placing the plane down carefully. He just looked at me, waiting. My heart was a frantic bird beating against my ribs. My throat was dry. "The other night," I started, my voice a hoarse whisper. "On the sofa. What did you mean?" He didn't pretend not to understand. He leaned back against the workbench, crossing his arms over his chest. The posture was defensive, but his eyes were wide open, vulnerable. "What did it sound like I meant?" he asked, his voice low. "I don't know," I lied, though I knew with every fiber of my being. It sounded different. He looked down at his hands, at the familiar landscape of scars and calluses. "When I first moved here," he said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the city outside, "the silence was the best part. I needed it. Then you moved in." He looked up, and his gaze was so intense it felt like a physical touch. "And you filled the silence. At first it was just noise, but then," he let out a long breath, "it became the sound of someone else being here. The sound of not being alone. I'd lie awake and I'd hear you breathing down the hall, and it was comforting." He gave a small, self-deprecating smile. "The snoring just meant you were sleeping deep. It meant you felt safe." The confession hung in the air between us, as real and tangible as the scent of cedar. He felt safe. He made me feel safe. All my carefully constructed walls, all my pride, all the fear I'd been clinging to like a shield crumbled into dust. He had taken the thing I was most ashamed of and turned it into a symbol of comfort and security. He had taken my brokenness and called it home. Julian, I breathed, his name an ache in my chest. He pushed off the workbench and took a step toward me, then another, until he was standing so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body. He was so tall. I had to tilt my head back to look at him. He slowly raised a hand, as if he was afraid I might bolt, and gently cupped my jaw. His thumb stroked my cheek, a rough, callous touch that sent a shiver down my spine. "Leo," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I am so tired of the quiet." And that was it. That was all it took. I surged forward, my hands fisting in the front of his shirt, and crashed my mouth against his. The kiss was clumsy and desperate and raw. It was full of all the unspoken tension, all the fear and longing of the past weeks. It was a question and an answer all at once. He responded instantly, his other arm coming around my waist, pulling me tight against him until there was no space left between us. His lips were firm and warm, and he tasted of coffee and wood smoke, and something that was uniquely, wonderfully him. The kiss deepened, gentling from frantic need to a slow, thorough exploration. It was a conversation.
Without words. A language we both finally understood. He broke the kiss, resting his forehead against mine, our breath mingling in the small space between us. "Stay," he murmured against my lips. It wasn't a question. It was a plea. I didn't need to be asked. I kissed him again, a promise and a surrender, and let him lead me out of the workshop and down the hall, leaving the silence behind us for good. Waking up was a slow, gentle drift into awareness. The first thing I registered was the light, a soft gray wash filtering through the blinds of a room that was not my own. The second was the warmth, a solid, living warmth pressed against my back, an arm draped possessively over my waist, a hand resting on my stomach. I was tangled in his sheets, in his bed, with him. Julian. My breath caught in my throat. There was always a moment in the cold light of morning when the regret and the shame would come rushing in. I braced for it, but it didn't come. Instead, there was just a profound, bone-deep sense of peace, of rightness. I lay perfectly still, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing against my neck. His room was like him. Simple, functional, and calm. A stack of books on the nightstand, a single frame photo of a rugged coastline, clothes folded neatly on a chair. No chaos, no pretense, just quiet strength. I felt his fingers twitch against my skin, a sleepy, unconscious movement. I didn't run. I didn't pull away. I settled back against him, letting his warmth seep into me, and closed my eyes, savoring the feeling of being held, of being anchored. For the first time in a very, very long time, I felt completely and utterly safe. A few days later, I was sitting at the kitchen table sketching in a notebook when Julian came home from work. He was dusted with sawdust as usual, and he smelled of the outdoors. He dropped his keys in the bowl by the door and walked over to me, leaning down to press a soft kiss to the top of my head. It was a simple domestic gesture, but it sent a thrill through me every time. Our dynamic had shifted so naturally it felt like we'd been doing this for years. The charged tension was gone, replaced by an easy intimacy that was both exhilarating and terrifyingly new. He went to the fridge and pulled out 2 beers, setting one down in front of me before leaning against the counter in his familiar pose. He looked at my drawing, a quick, rough sketch of the rocking horse he had finished for his niece. "That's good," he said, taking a long drink of his beer. "Thanks," I said, my cheeks warming. I was thinking, maybe you could teach me. How to work with wood, I mean. Just the basics. The request felt huge, a step into his world that I wasn't sure I was allowed to take. He looked at me, a slow smile spreading across his face. It was a rare, beautiful thing that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. "Yeah," he said. "I can do that." We fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that was now our native language. I looked around the small apartment, at the beige walls that no longer felt like a prison, at the worn-out sofa where he had covered me with a blanket, at the quiet, steady man who had seen all my broken pieces and hadn't tried to fix me, but had simply made space for me to heal. I had come here to hide, to disappear. I had been so sure that building walls was the only way to protect myself. But Julian hadn't broken my walls down. He'd just been so patient, so solid, that I'd eventually opened the door myself. He had shown me that true safety wasn't about isolation. It was about finding the right person to be vulnerable with. The ache behind my sternum, the one I'd carried for so long, was finally gone. In its place was a quiet, hopeful hum. I had stopped running. I was home. Wouldn't you trade a world of noise for a quiet so full of love it says everything you need to hear? If you enjoyed this story, please give it a like, subscribe for more, and let me know your thoughts in the comments below.